Dr. Verny, thank you so much for joining us here on the Science of Psychotherapy podcast. It's so great to see you.
Thank you. Great to be here.
And Richard here, the terrible duo that we are, but your book was brought to our attention. I mean, it was released towards the end of last year, but and it's not your only book, of course. There's been a number of others, and it's just wonderful. So we had to talk to you, and so now we've got you.
Yeah, so maybe we can start off with just a bit of an introduction. Let our listeners know sort of a bit of your background.
Sure. Thank you for that. I guess we could go back to when I was 13 years old, and I was staying in Vienna, and one of the first books that I read in German when I was almost unable to read German. I just had sort of a Czech-German dictionary in my hand, and I came across this book by Freud, and it was called The Interpretation of Dreams.
Mm-hmm.
And so I knew that Freud was important. Like I didn't know who he was or whatever, but I had enough education to know that Freud was important and that I should read it. So I started reading it, and I became totally fascinated by the way he sort of explored the unconscious. And so it was then and there that I made up my mind that I would become a psychiatrist. And then eventually, a few years later, we ended up in Toronto, Canada. I went to medical school in Toronto, and fortunately or unfortunately, depending how you look at it, we had a lot of professors, medical doctors, professors, who went sort of through the Second World War, and they were sort of pretty tough fellows. They did not have much liking for psychiatry. And the general impression that I got from these doctors, who used to be colonels and majors and God knows what in the Canadian Army, was that psychiatrists spend all their time listening to rich ladies complaining about their dachshunds.
Yes.
So that was not terribly appealing. Like I didn't want to spend the rest of my life, doing that. And so then and there, I made up my mind. I changed courses, and I thought I would like to become an obstetrician. And so I went into obstetrics for a little while, but I absolutely hated the way obstetricians treated pregnant women. And particularly when they were giving birth, they would yell at them, push, push, push. And then there was so much violence and so much blood. The whole scene just was not to my liking. And so then I thought, well, I had an opportunity to work in a psychiatric hospital during the summer. So I thought, well, this is sort of my last chance. Let's see if perhaps psychiatry, beckons me back. And so I went to the psychiatric hospital in Upper New York State, which was one of those old-time large hospitals, 5,000 patients, about 25 doctors. And so I was assigned to the emergency department where people first came in, and, they were pretty, psychotic, like they were all, hearing voices and being delusional and hallucinating, all that kind of stuff. And so the only thing I really knew about psychiatry was that you took a history and you asked about family and you asked about dreams, of course, because I still remembered Freud. So I had a tiny little office and I started seeing people. And within a few days, the word got around that there's actually a psychiatrist here who talks to people.
Wow.
So there would be these long lineups in front of my office, people trying to see me and talk to me. And I saw very, very, very quickly, within a few weeks, that my patients were just being discharged left and right whereas the other patients of the other doctors were just getting sicker and sicker.
Yeah, beautiful.
So, then I could see that it wasn't just rich old ladies, looking after their favorite dogs and cats, but actually you could do some real important work. So that's when I went into psychiatry. I was sort of analytically oriented. I was always interested in insight. I was always interested in past family histories. I was interested in the roots of the problem. I was not interested in just treating the problem, which was becoming more and more popular. And of course, today it's the thing that most psychiatrists do. I was interested in trying to get down to the very beginning, to the roots of the problem. And so one day, discussing a dream with a young man, he suddenly started crying like a little baby. And he did that for about 10 minutes. I did not interrupt him. I let him cry for about 10 minutes. And he seemed to be in an altered state of consciousness. And then he came out of it. And I asked him what did just happen. And he said, well, I had just found myself as a little baby in a crib. And I was crying for my mother. And then, being a somewhat skeptical young lawyer, he said, there's something wrong with this picture, because I've actually seen photographs of myself as a baby, and they were always taken in a blue crib. And this crib here now was white. So I told him to go and talk to his mother. He was still a young man. His family was still alive. And he came back the following week and he said, this is amazing. But it seems that the first 3 months of my life, my parents did not have enough money to buy my own crib. I slept in a borrowed crib. The borrowed crib was from a neighbor and it was white. And it was only 3 months later that my parents bought me the blue crib, which all the pictures are taken from. So that was a bit of a head scratcher. I went to the University of Toronto, which is a very good school, followed up by Harvard University in Boston, which is one of the best in the world. And I was always taught that children before the age of 2 don't remember anything. So how could this be possible? And so as time went on, I heard more and more stories like that. And so I began to wonder, whether sort of the accepted wisdom, in quotation marks, the accepted wisdom that was being taught in academia was wrong. And so then what happened next was that I wrote a paper, and it was called The Psychic Life of the Unborn Child. And I got to present it at the 5th International Congress on Psychosomatic Obstetrics and Gynecology in Rome. And at that convention, I was Ronnie Lang, and many of the leading lights of psychiatry and obstetrics from all over the world. There were 500-600 people there. It was an amazing crowd. I mean, I was a total unknown. I was incredibly lucky to have my paper accepted. Not only was it accepted, but it was put on the best morning of the whole convention. So, I got 20 minutes, not a lot of time, but enough to sort of put forth my ideas, which essentially were that children before the age of 2 can remember their birth, and perhaps even pre-birth. And then there was this incredible electrical excitement in the crowd when I presented my paper. And it was obvious that it had hit a receptive chord in people. Like people were electrified. And so when I saw that, I said at the end of my 20-minute talk, I said, if anyone here would like to continue talking about this, come up to my room at 5:00 and we'll talk some more. And so at 5:00, Ronnie Lang and many of the others came to my room. And once again, it was like the mental hospital. There was this long lineup in front of my room, and people were trying to get in, and we were talking. Oh, it was great fun. It was wonderful. It was wonderful. So then I saw that here was something that people are really, really interested in. And so that's when I started writing my book, which eventually 3 years later was published as The Secret Life of the Unborn Child. And that was published by Simon & Schuster. And that changed my life. And I'm told by many, many people that it changed their lives too. And that book has now been published in 27 countries.
Wonderful.
And it's still selling. People are still writing me about it. So it has been a wonderful, wonderful experience. But, and I'm coming now to the present, but I was always mystified as to how it is that children, even before the age of 6 months after conception, which is sort of when you can say that the beginnings of the brain as we know it sort of are formed. How can children before the age of 6 months, before the end of the second trimester, remember anything? How is this possible? And I've always been scientifically oriented, and I was wondering, is there a scientific explanation for this? And it has always bothered me that I did not have an answer to this question. And then 7 years ago, I read this account of a Frenchman, 44-year-old Frenchman, who went to see his doctor because he had some weakness in his left leg. And when they did very thorough lab tests and x-rays and God knows what, they found out that he had virtually no brain. He had a thin crust of cortical tissue, and the rest of his skull was filled with fluid, cerebrovascular fluid. And medical doctors call it hydrocephalus, water on the brain. Now, this was a 44-year-old married man, 2 children, and working as a civil servant. How is this possible? But we know it is. It's there, right? It's happening. You can't deny it. So that's when I started looking into the literature. And to my surprise, I found that actually there was quite a bit of literature on children having great part of their brain removed because of epilepsy or brain tumors, and they continue to function normally. And the same as adults. There are quite a number of fantastic, totally verified, totally supported, evidence-based studies done on these people. And not all of them are normal, but the great majority of them act and continue to think and behave normally. So when I saw that, I thought to myself, there has to be a backup system. If there is no brain and the person is still brainy, the person still has a mind, then where is this mind coming from? Where is it anchored? And so that's when I thought that it must be below the neck in the rest of the body. And so that's what led me then to the book that you have in front of you now, or somewhere in your library, called The Embodied Mind. So,
and that beautiful extension, Understanding the Mysteries of Cellular Memory, Consciousness, and Our Bodies. And it's so, listening to that story and that run through and that history as we come up, talking about people with huge brain damage. I spent some time in friendship with a chap who I think he was called the Jigsaw Man. I'm not sure, but he was in the war in Argentina. He's one of the British soldiers and had half his brain was removed.
Yes.
And he came, and anyway, it was great. He had a small problem with some motor movements.
Yeah.
But fundamentally, and this idea, my mentor, Ernest Rossi, he was the student of Milton Erickson, who was another psychiatrist who was exploring what you were discovering, that actually there were human beings there. So I'm sort of connected into that framework, and I've actually done a lot of work in reviewing, and I was charged with that, the 16 volumes of Erickson, so I know a lot of the stories. So when you say those things, I go, oh wow, this is the amazement, and it kind of brings us around to also our book of saying there is a lot we need to know about.
Yes.
We need to know about. So just that little sort of recap of my reactions there. Sorry, Matt, I just, because there were so many things
Fine.
I'm wondering if you could give us a sort of a large perspective view of like this whole body consciousness, the idea of, cellular and embodied consciousness. Are you able to sort of give us the big picture?
Well, the big picture, essentially what scientists have, there are quite a few directions in which we can go here because it is a complex subject. One of the things that scientists have not recognized sufficiently is the incredible intelligence of our cells, the smallest units in our bodies. And they have failed to recognize the fact that cells in the rest of our bodies are not that different from neurons. Scientists have focused for many, many years, and certainly the last 200 years, on the brain and the neurons. Once the neurons were discovered, it has been totally sort of corticocentric. The brain. A couple of years ago, even in the United States, I think it was declared the century of the brain, or the year of the brain.
That's right, the 90s, the decade of the brain. That's right. Bush did that.
Something like that. And I think that also sort of goes with our culture, because I'm not an anthropologist or a sociologist, but you and I know that our culture for the last 2,000 years, 5,000 years, whatever, has been incredibly patriarchal, which means that it has been hierarchical. And hierarchical means that the head is at the top and the feet are at the bottom, and sort of everything in between really doesn't matter very much. We talk about the head of state, or getting ahead, or who heads this company, heading into the wind, etc., etc., etc. It's all about the head, and so it is not surprising that medicine and pharmacological companies, and we may come to that later, have focused all their attention on the head instead of the rest of the body. And particularly, not only what goes on in the cells, and I want to talk about that a little bit, but also particularly the organs of the heart and the gut, which are incredibly important. So, not recognizing the connections and putting all your values and all your focus in research and treatment on the head, whether it's Alzheimer's or whether it's mental health, that I'm sure, Richard, you would be interested in. It's all about, let's try to find something that is going to be an antidepressant that is going to increase your serotonin in the brain. But actually, most of the serotonin is produced in the gut. It's not produced in the brain. And many of the antidepressants, which again, most psychiatrists, neurologists, pharmacologists don't recognize, many of the antidepressants actually work on the gut bacteria and have their effect because their effect on gut bacteria which then will affect the brain. So they really have it sort of upside down. Instead of looking at everything from top down, what I'm trying to do is look at it from the bottom up, and that way create a more balanced approach to health. I'm not saying that it should be all bottom up, but it certainly is wrong to consider it all top down.
Well, you'll be very pleased with us because we're exactly been following and learning and working through that, and we've done a lot of that in our book, our new book. We're trying to make it sort of accessible.
Yes.
But one of the things that Ernie Rossi would talk about, and we spoke a lot, because he was also one of the first to really talk about the psychobiology of our functions. And he'd talk about state-dependent memory learning and behavior and activity-dependent memory learning behavior. Now, this is when we're getting down into cellular states and biochemical milieus and this sort of aspect. Is this where we can start talking about the cells and how they create states of being that enable us, that are reflective of memories, although it's not like those autobiographical pictorial memories so much, but it's a different type of frame of memory. Am I on the right track there?
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. But again, from a scientific standpoint, I'm interested, how do the cells do this? It's not enough for me to say, yes, cells contain memory. So I'm also interested in trying to find out, how does that work? And so I've been looking, for example, at the cellular membrane, and I've been looking at the DNA, which now scientists have been able to put an incredible amount of data into living cell DNAs. So that they act like little computers, and even more so like microchips. And so it's really, really interesting how much data, how much information each cell can contain. And of course, the other thing that's important is that cells form networks, and it is their networking, it's the cells working together that is so incredibly powerful. It's just like connecting a lot of computers. Instead of having a single computer, if you really want to have, tremendous amount of memory, you connect several computers. And so it's the same thing that's happening in our body. So all of these cells are connected, and then they are connected to the tissues like the heart and the gut, as I've said. And one of the most important avenues for connecting the brain to the heart, to the gut, is the vagus nerve. And I'm sure you know that. Mm-hmm. And so that is an incredibly important avenue for communication, and signals are being sent both ways, from the brain down to the heart and the gut, and then up from the gut to the heart and the brain. So again, it's something that our listeners need to keep in mind, that there is this, bidirectional communication. It's not unidirectional. It's not just the vagus nerve from the brain down to the rest of the body. It's also in the opposite direction.
You're reminding me of a guest we had recently, Dr. John Leaf. And he has written a book about the secret life. What is it? The secret language of cells.
Okay.
And it was just amazing listening to him about the collective wisdom of cells and how they communicate, and the myriad ways that they communicate. Yes. And he picked a few examples, like killer T cells sort of taking the lead when it comes to an immune response, in taking a lead in also instructing neurons and in ways, in communication networks that we hadn't really known about before. And so the secret language, it sounds like the secret life that you were writing about.
Yes.
It's truly incredible, the autonomy that the cellular networks seem to have.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I guess I guess that more and more scientists are going to wake up to this, and that's all for the good of mankind.
Yes, we've been trying. At the moment, we're now campaigning with our book called The Science of Psychotherapy and our project, and we're trying to say to people that science has got hijacked. That word, it's been hijacked to be reductionism and a mechanism, and instead of being the investigation of what is. It's exactly as you say. If science gets a hold of something, they say, "Oh, we are now defining what is." And one of the examples you gave, which is so perfect, is that the brain is the thing that does all the is the center of everything.
It does all,
and
all
then
the work.
it creates this bias and leaves you away from this fascination. And so, just getting back, I just wanted to add that in, go and circle back to this cellular interaction, this cellular discussion and memory framework. Could you expand a little bit more on the way you describe that and what you talk about in the book in the context of those cells?
Well, one of the interesting facets of this is, of course, when you have when people donate their hearts, and you have, like just a couple of weeks ago in the United States, there was a pig's heart was placed into a person, right? So we have this heart transplantation, but people don't realize that the heart is not just a pump, but it's tissues, right? It's a living organ. And as a living organ made up of tissues, which are made up of cells, it is transferring memory from those cells into the person who is accepting the heart. So what you have here, and there are quite a number of accounts of this, is that with heart transplantation, you are also transplanting personality, or at least some aspects of personality. And so I have a chapter on that in my book. And there are many, many reports that I reference where you have people totally changing their personality. A woman who never loved, who was a vegetarian, suddenly loves meat. And it seems that the heart that she got from a young man, he only ate meat and hated veggies. That kind of personality change has been reported over and over and over again. And yet, and I was speaking to a medical doctor in California the other day who was doing heart transplants. And I said, do you ever mention to your patients that there might be the possibility of a change in personality? Never. We don't talk about that.
Yes, yeah. I have another, actually, a colleague in California, a heart surgeon, who's quite the opposite. He says, and he's doing quite a lot of things. He doesn't necessarily warn them as a likelihood, but he's been collecting stories.
Really?
On this stuff. Really, really interesting stuff.
I would like you to put me in touch with that man if you could.
I will. It's been a few years since I've seen him, but I'm sure I'll be able to.
I would really, really appreciate that. That would be a really important contact for me. Yeah. So, coming back to your question about cellular intelligence and cellular memory, these cells contain memories. We don't know what kinds of memories they contain. It's too early at this point to say definitely what they contain. But obviously, as a tissue with millions and millions of cells working together, there obviously is here a network of memories which is being transferred. So I think that we ought to be very, very careful before we start transplanting pigs' hearts to people, because God knows what kind of personality they will develop.
Yes, one of the things that I've read quite a bit about is dream states for people that have had heart transplants, and they will, they'll seem to have had memories of the person that they've got the heart from. And I don't know, is that because in a sleep state, in a subconscious state, they're more receptive to?
Oh, I think that's a very important point that you're raising. People always say, well, how come not everybody has changes in their personality or does not receive dreams from the donor? Well, exactly. You put your finger on it. It is because some people are more receptive than others. As a psychiatrist who has worked for many, many years with patients, I have found that there are huge differences in terms of how some patients can work and gain insight and can work with dreams, and others who are just not capable. I will say to them, well, what do you think this means? I don't know. You tell me. You are the psychiatrist. That's not what you want to hear as a psychiatrist.
Yeah.
I mean, there's this thing of the dream sort of state, the dream capacity of this effort of the conscious mind or our upper regions, upper cognitive, to try and make sense of the information that's coming to it. I mean, we get sort of conscious dreaming and daydreams in confabulation in older people.
Yes.
And this idea of cells which have developed over time, because obviously they alter through experience, then contributing states, biochemical states and ionic variations. And it's that interpretation. And I sometimes look at those people who aren't able to recall their dreams or don't look for the metaphors. That's just a cognitive sort of a cortical process of diminished cortical process, and then they're missing the joys of life. They're missing the great mysteries of what's your liver talking to you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. Yeah, and people are so different, and some people have a certain talent. It's almost like having a talent for painting or a talent for, working with your hands. Some people have a talent for insight. They are introspective, and others are not.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, that's just... and this is, again, what we're so interested in and what we're loving about, the work you're doing. It's taking things from the human perspective first. There's a humanism in here first that we seek to understand and embellish, and perhaps have what I call, I use that psychotherapeutic term, attunement. Have a deeper attunement to the other.
Oh, that's true. And again, speaking of attunement, the heart has got this incredible energetic outpouring around it. We often refer to people perhaps having an aura, right? But there's this magnetic field that the heart produces, which is something like 5,000 times stronger than the magnetic field that the brain produces. So very, often when people say, I fell in love with her the first time I saw her or him, whatever. It's usually, I would say, scientifically, it's because they are on the same wavelengths. Somehow their hearts connected with each other. And so energetically, they connected.
Yeah.
And, you do psychotherapy, right?
Yes, in principle, we call it that. Yeah.
Okay. So I think the same thing applies, in psychotherapy. I'm sure that you have had the experience that with some people, you almost click right away. And with others, no matter how hard you try, it's just not happening.
Yeah. And one of the other aspects of that we've learned is that electromagnetic field of the heart can entrain brainwave activity. And so the dominant heart, whatever it is field, can align brainwave activity. So you can have a dominant person in the room purely from what's radiating from their heart, which is just fascinating.
Right. Well, I think it's important to meet people where they are instead of trying to change them. And so I think it's important for people practicing psychotherapy, psychiatry, counseling whatever, to accurately sort of assess where that person is, and then try to adjust your therapy to where they are instead of where you are.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, one of the things that I wanted to touch on was in terms of generational trauma, which you mentioned.
Yes.
Can we just talk about what is going on there in terms of the transmission of generational trauma?
Well, some of that is pretty mysterious, but at least some of it can be explained in terms of the propositions that I put forward in my book. There is a lot of research that shows that you can transfer stress, let's say, from fathers or mothers to their children, and even into second generations.
Mm-hmm.
And there's wonderful research on stressed fathers, for example, who then they were stressed before they conceived a child. And then that child, particularly if the child is male, grows up and is stressed, and his child will also show effects of stress. And the same thing, very similar, happens with mothers. So we know that stress can be passed down through generations. I think that in addition to stress, probably other experiences of the parents are passed down through generations. And I will just give you an example. I heard, in Canada, we have had these schools where Indigenous people were being taken in, as children, residential schools, and they were terribly mistreated. So one of these children grew up, married, and then when his daughter was about 5 or 6 years old, she started having terrible nightmares. And he asked her what they were, and she wouldn't tell him. And then when she reached about the age of 12, suddenly one day she came out and told him what it was. And she was having this dream of a man all dressed in black and with a black mask coming into the room where she slept and picking her up and taking her away, and then doing something to her. So it turns out that the father, who never told his daughter about his experiences in residential school, when he was 6 years old and he was sleeping with the rest of the boys in the dormitory, every night, one of the priests, dressed all in black, with a black mask, came in and picked up one of the children, including him once in a while, and sexually abused them. He never told his daughter.
That's a remarkably accurate memory that's transferred there.
It's remarkably accurate, and I don't think the majority of memories are like that. But you could, but I think that you could easily have a phobia, for example, that could be transmitted. People who are afraid of water or blackness, for example, in this case, perhaps a person in black might scare them and they would have no idea why. So I think that probably many phobias, anxieties, even perhaps a depressive personality might originate with parental experiences.
And we've got to remember that when a child is in utero, a baby is in utero, there are actually 3 sets of DNA functioning in the system. There's the mother's, there's the child's, and then of course the child has already made the zygotes, the ova for the future. It's an extraordinary. So just to think, even going back, and we know, epigenetic inheritance can survive over several generations, perhaps 5, 6, 7 generations.
Exactly.
And the lack of attention to this by the science because it's too busy or it's too protective. Is it protective of itself? These sorts of things curious to us.
Yeah, I don't know whether it's protective. It's just kind of tradition oriented. It seems that most scientists, once they graduate, they continue to practice and believe what they were taught in graduate school at university. And they are hesitant, reluctant to make a leap into something new.
Right. So I wonder if you're speaking of these things in a more collective culture,
yes,
where the links between the past and the present, are a lot stronger in the culture, that this may not be so surprising.
Yes, you're absolutely right, and I'm sure that would also be relevant to Australia and the collective historical trauma that your Aboriginal people carry.
Yeah,
and it's something that we're grasping to understand. I think as we have this interesting push me pull you thing going on in Western culture at the moment.
Yes.
I'm not sure about others because I'm not there so much, but the desire to change and the pressure to change and repair things that were imbalanced or unfair, and actually this equal pull and pressure for things to remain the same.
Yes.
I think this is a fairly, when you go down to cells, this is actually one of the things that we know cells do fight about in themselves.
Yes, homeostasis.
This is a general sort of a fundamental principle of being. But when we bring it into culture, it starts to get a lot more complex.
Yeah, in culture, it becomes resistance to change.
Yes,
right.
Yes.
Yeah. And of course, just one more thing in terms of the historical and collective trauma that we just talked about. Just think of the tremendous trauma that people in Ukraine are experiencing right now.
Yes.
Right? And think of their children and their children's children. I mean, this is going to be a huge problem because millions and millions of people are being affected. So God knows what the world is going to look like, like 20 years from now, when the children of the adults now start growing up and how they will be traumatized, right?
Yeah.
So this is very much a global problem right now.
Yeah.
And we can look on the cellular level, so on different levels, certainly here a social upheaval. There we have emotional upheaval, trauma upheaval. We've had a dietary upheaval over the last things. We've had movement and activity upheaval by the increasing sedentary nature that we have.
Right.
And then, of course, this hugely peculiar one of separation from people you're talking to through these electronic frameworks. I'm just sitting here wondering whether I should be excited about the future or just terrified. But it certainly will be interesting.
Well, speaking of that, if I may, just for a moment, optimism is really, really important, And one of the wonderful things about the science of epigenetics is that we know that we are all a work in progress. Everything is in flux. And so this is both to our benefit and, of course, also to our destruction. But in terms of benefit, how you think about yourself influences every cell in your body. It influences the genes, because in epigenetics, we are not talking about changing the genes. We are talking about how we change the activity of the genes. So we turn them on or we turn them off. I'm sure you know that. So it's the same thing that's happening now. We have really, really interesting research on optimism and how our thoughts can influence everything around us. Of course, there's the whole There's the whole area of quantum physics, which shows that, the presence of an observer will influence how the experiment proceeds, right? I want to tell you about this experiment, the study that was done in New York on some hotel mates, because I want to leave on an optimistic note, if you can.
Yes, I was dragging us down. That's terrible. Yeah.
So there were these 82 hotel mates in New York, and a psychologist from Harvard did a study on them, and he divided them, she divided them into two groups, 41 each. And to one group, she said that the work that you're doing actually meets the standards set by the United States, I don't know, some health czar, somebody in charge of health in the United States. And it sets the standard for exercise. So actually, your work is like exercise. So I just want you to know that, she said. 30 days later, she compared the group, the one that she told, the experimental group and the control group. In the experimental group, the women on the average lost weight, their blood pressure went down, their circumference around their abdomen went down, their heart rate decreased. They were better on 5 or 6 different measurements. They did not change what they were doing. They only changed what they thought they were doing.
Yes, the opportunity and the appropriate circumstances, right. The body will then, when given respond. It will respond, and it prefers to move in a better direction.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. I got to tell
autonomy. Beautiful story.
All right, fantastic. We are sort of running out of time, and I think I was joking with you before we started, Dr. Verny, that we'll have to get you back because we're not going to be able to cover everything, and certainly we didn't.
We've just scratched the surface.
I would love to be back.
Great.
Fantastic, because I want to ask you a little bit about psychopharmacology and a whole bunch of other questions. So,
okay.
Just a reminder to everybody, it is the Embodied Mind, Understanding the Mysteries of Cellular Memory, Consciousness, and Our Bodies, and we'll put a link in the show notes.
Great.
So for now, we'll bid our fond adieus, but we look forward to the next time in maybe a month or so. It'd be great.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you,
Fantastic.
Matt.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.